speaking of sound, many classic film titles that are being released on Blu-ray, and also in the DVD period as well, do have one thing in common, definitely for Blu-ray, and that is that they all have at least a 5.1 audio soundtrack, even though the film may have been mono originally. And how do you feel about the ability that we have now to alter classic films from their original formats for something like Blu-ray?
Well, I mean, there's always, I feel that what's really important is to present the film in the original format, the right aspect ratio size of the screen, as best as you can get to the color, the original version of the color that the cinematographer is still available, that sort of thing, the sound. But I took advantage of the capabilities that were offered by these new technologies that I probably didn't have at the time, and this was Taxi Driver, because it turned out that Bernard Herrmann recorded the score of the film in stereo. But at that time, I mean, that type of picture was just not being released in stereo. It was mono, and it was mixed mono. We mixed it in 5 days, and you know, wonderful original stereo score. And for the original version of the DVD, we created a new score. I mean, we created a new soundtrack that I helped supervise of the stereo music, balanced with the dialogue track. But here's the thing: when I went in to check on the transition to this new format, I found that the dialogue was hidden behind, in my ear, the dialogue was hidden behind the music. So that was the key thing. I brought all the dialogue back to the center track and brought it up front. I remember doing that.
Sure.
So that I felt that it was balanced properly. I mean, I feel if you're going to do that and you're going to present it a certain way, and people are now used to sound in their homes, I'm even used to it. The sound comes from left, right, behind you, and that sort of thing. For a classic film, that is not necessarily exactly how it was done, but if you also have available the original mono track on the DVD, on the Blu-ray, I mean, this is, for me, this is something that's totally valid. We also have to remember that many films were released in what was called, do you remember, there were versions of stereo back 40, 50 years ago, maybe more.
Correct.
Certainly when I was a film goer, back in the late 40s, early 50s, Prospector sound. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It was called Made in Prospector sound. And also the very early stereo tracks, which still exist in many of the classic films, where your person comes in the right frame, you hear them on the right frame. Person goes across the frame, you see them hear them going across the frame out the left. You know, it's very crude and everything, but it was stereo. It was stereo. And therefore, you know, if we can enhance that a little bit to make that smoother on a Blu-ray, it's totally valid. I mean, musicals like A Star Is Born and so many others had those stereo tracks. But Prospector sound goes all the way back to, I think, in the 40s, if I'm not mistaken. I may be wrong there. But pictures like Shane, I think, was in Prospector sound, and many others.
It's interesting. We were just working on a film that I know you know called Jubal, which is Delmer Dave's Western with Glenn Ford.
Oh, yes, that's right.
And we were preparing it for a screening at the London Film Festival recently. And literally, like 1 month ago, came across the original stereo soundtrack, which hadn't been used, you know, for like 50 years. Also, am reminded. Yeah. So I'm also reminded.
Go ahead.
It was in the late 80s. I was in a storage facility looking in a box for something entirely different. Came across these 2 tapes that were 4-track stereo tapes of Taxi Driver, and I thought at the time, gee, I can't really do anything with these, you know. And so I thought one day I'll be able to do something with this. I didn't know it takes so long.
That was the state of film preservation at the time. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't up to you. I mean, that's what it is. But you know, the original track, the original stereo tracks of Jubal and pictures like that, it creates a big difference in the impression of the sound that the impression the film makes. It really is. Very often I found that films that were recorded in stereo tracks in the early 50s, when they're transferred to all you have is the mono, I find that sometimes the effectiveness of the picture isn't as strong. And I think finding these tracks or enhancing the mono in some way to maybe even, just a thought, to to replicate what may have been stereo at the time, but was considered stereo, could really enhance the viewing of the picture. When I mean enhance the viewing, I mean, what's very important is that, you know, I remember a friend of mine back in the early, mid-70s, getting a chance to see East of Eden, and it was at a theater in LA, and we got to the theater, couldn't wait to show him. He was a very young person, and I said, well, wait till you see James Dean in this film, it's amazing. And we got to the booth, and they said, brand new print, except it's 16mm flat. And so we decided, we're here, we came all the way from LA, we got to drive away, we're here, let's go in. And after the film was over, they you know, still pretty effective for me, but the younger people didn't feel the power of it. They didn't feel the power of it, and I think it's because the nature of, it's what happens when you don't have as good a sound track as possible, as clear an image as possible. You can't see the performance. You can't see the actor's eyes. You know, and I think I don't say that if Dean or Raymond Massey in the film, or Julie Harris, but it's the whole overall effect. Sure. And I think these are subtle things the audience can't tell. You know, they just know that the film wasn't as good as the last time. They say because it's not being projected the right way.
Yeah.
In any event, this is one example in the 70s.
Well, you mentioned the state of preservation. Let's talk a little bit about film preservation. One of the side benefits of the advent of DVD in the mid-90s was that a lot of the studios had to dig back into the libraries. It was actually quite a boon to the cause of restoration. Do you see a similar effect taking place right now with Blu-ray?
Well, yeah, I definitely do, because the home viewer, luckily, is demanding the best quality they can get for the image, and the higher quality picture and audio, the best possible sound source material, higher resolution of HD for Blu-ray, you know, demands greater fidelity to the original source materials. And so the studios are, in effect, going back and restoring many titles to rise the level to the technical capabilities of Blu-ray. For example, I know you just did Dr. Strangelove.
Yes.
Was it 4K?
We did a 4K restoration, partly because it needed it, but also in preparation for the Blu-ray.
Well, this is, excuse me, this is interesting, because I remember when we asked Stanley Kubrick to become part of the Film Foundation back in 1990, he agreed by fax. And he did indicate that he was very concerned about Dr. Strangelove. In fact, he was beginning a process, and this is what he said. You may know better, Rover, than me on this one, but he was beginning a process where he was actually photographing each frame with a still camera to create the best possible restoration that he could make himself. I don't think he ever finished that. I don't know if he really was serious about that, but 4K restoration is, for the Blu-ray is an amazing thing. But you had some issues there, didn't you, in terms of what do you do with, for example, if the 4K, when you screen the film, when you screen it in the theater, it's one thing, but when you see it at home and it's got this extraordinary fidelity to it, you know, there are strings that are showing of airplanes and that sort of thing. Sure. What were you able to do to remain accurate, but also keep the purity of the original vision of the filmmaker, but not make it obvious?